Hey.
Hello, Ranga.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you are joining. Thank you very much for joining this webinar titled, I think I'm audible.
Yes,
The title Nexus,
yes, I can hear you.
Sustainable Consumption and Production, Circular Economy and Climate Change. So this webinar is organized as a part of a series that we are conducting run up to the COP28 and beyond to discuss about the sustainable consumption and production, circularity, and climate change. So thank you very much for joining. So I think we have quite a number of people, so probably we can allow a little time for them to join. But in the meantime, I would like to invite the team leader of the Switch Asia policy support component, Dr. Zenata Fadiva, to give the welcome remarks, welcome you, and give a brief introduction to the particular webinar. Zenata, over to you.
Thank you, Ranga. Good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we find ourselves in a world which is traditionally and for a long time, but probably a little bit poetically, but not anymore, is described by the term risk society. And today, this definition of risk society has been taken a whole new meaning. We are confronting multiple crises simultaneously, and it is becoming very, very clear that the triple planetary crisis encompassing climate change, loss of nature and biodiversity, and dramatic expansion of pollution is no longer a problem for future generations to grapple with. It is squarely our challenge to face to ensure the planet stays livable to humankind and humankind's in our generation. The interconnectedness of these three crises is undeniable, and climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution are not isolated issues, even though very often they are taken on board by very different organizations. Those crises are interrelated and do reinforce one another. However, the silver lining lies in the fact that actions taken in each of these areas, if properly designed and targeted, also help mitigate the impact of the others. The European Union Switch Asia program, which I represent, has been diligently promoting sustainable consumption and production since 2007. This program recognizes the critical interplay between the consumption of resources in production and supply chains and climate change. Materials conversion into products in their distribution are the key determinant for energy use, which drives, in turn, greenhouse gas emissions. And emissions are originating along the supply chain of various sectors, such as construction, textile, food, plastic, electronics, and many others, are contributing significantly to climate change. In turn, climate change, as we know, has far-reaching implications for each and every sector on the planet, whether it would be construction and building or insurance sector. SCP, or Sustainable Consumption and Production Actions, with which we as program deal, have this far largely, in our belief and experience, untapped potential to contribute significantly to both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And while we acknowledge the existence of this connection, we must recognize together that this is true, its true potential has yet to be fully harnessed. This is why, in this present stage, Switch Asia is placing special emphasis on bringing together policy discussions on materials through SCP, through sustainable consumption and production, and climate, including examining the nexus between SCP policies and the nationally determined contributions of the countries. And this is exactly what this webinar is all about. In our increasingly interconnected world, it is imperative that we explore these synergies and leverage them to address the triple planetary crisis effectively in partnership with organizations that approach traditionally. Colleagues, can I ask please to mute your mics? Thank you so much. So what we need to do is really to address this triple planetary crisis in partnership with organizations that approach this crisis traditionally, either from the climate or from the resource perspective. But those organizations today, and the representatives of these organizations are with us today on the panel, clearly see the need of bringing these issues and all these aspects together. The presenters who are to speak on behalf of these organizations will set the stage for discussion on integrating these two critical issues and finding synergistic solutions. Panel discussions will follow after their individual interventions, and these panel discussions would be exploring challenges and opportunities in combining climate actions with sustainable consumption and production, or with resource use, sharing experiences from Asia-Pacific countries, and considering this potential for including SCP actions into NDC, among other issues. By uniting our efforts and integrating our policies, we can make a substantial impact on these interconnected challenges and work towards more sustainable and resilient future. With this, may I thank you and wish us all important insights following from this discussion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ranga.
Thank you so much, Zenaida, for that introductory note. Ladies and gentlemen, as Zenaida mentioned, we have two sections of this webinar. One is where we have two key presentations, and then we are moving to the panel discussions. And during the key presentations, we are covering two aspects of it. One from the climate change aspect and another one from the resources aspect. So to start the key presentation, I would like to invite Mr. Mazaharul Hala, popularly known as Babu in the circle. He's the regional coordinator for climate change for the Asia-Pacific Office of UN Environment. So giving a background to Babu, he has obtained his master's degree in geography in 1989 in Bangladesh, and areas of specialization are in adaptation and low carbon development to climate change, integrating climate change into development planning and international negotiations. He started his professional career as a young researcher with the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies in 1992, and he joined UNEP as a regional coordinator climate change for the Asia-Pacific Office in 2009, and providing strategic and political guidance to design and implement climate action in the region. He has also served in the Ministry of Environment and Forest, Government of Bangladesh, as a national project coordinator, and successfully undertaken inclusive process of formulation National Adaptation Program of Action, UNAPA. He attended climate change negotiations for more than a decade and coordinated adaptation group for G77 and China during 2007 and 2009. He worked as a lead author for Working Group 2 of IPCC 5th Assessment Report 2. So he received an international fellowship from International Institute for Environment and Development, IID, under climate change program for 3 years in 2006. So Babu, over to you to do the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ranga, and thank you, Zenaida, particularly highlighting the triple planetary crisis and their interlinkages. UNEP is one of the organizations maybe trying to address all the triple planetary crises within the organizational, the portfolio, and through it, the medium-term strategy. I'm just going to talk about the impacts and the emission gaps, and I'll be focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. What I'm going to start with, why you are talking about the impacts and the emission gaps, and I would like to start with the Paris Agreement and the subsequent decision, which are basically important starting point for our discussion. So if we look into the Paris Agreement in the context of the temperature goal, is basically objective is to limit the increase of the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursuing the efforts to limit it to the 1.5 degree above the pre-industrial level. And if we look into the subsequent decisions from the COP, it also talks about picking the greenhouse gas emission, which is as soon as possible, preparing and communicating the nationally determined contribution, which is the primary means for the countries to commit themselves, how much the greenhouse gas they would like to reduce. But also there are the decisions related to the phase down of the unabated, the coal power, and the phase out of inefficient the fossil fuels. And also they have established the work program on the just transition, as well as talked about the finance flow towards the low greenhouse gas emission and the climate resilient development. So that is the framework that we have under the climate change in the context of the temperature goal and how to limit that. Next slide, please. Now, if we also look into the other side of the climate change, which is the impact related, is the adaptation, how to address the impact. So what we have in the global decisions, particularly in the Paris Agreement and the Convention, is increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impact of climate change. But we also have now the global goal on adaptation, which has the three critical elements. One is enhancing the adaptive capacity, strengthening the resilience, and reducing the vulnerability. Like the triple planetary crisis that Zenata mentioned, if we look into all these three aspects of the adaptation, they are also interlinked. They don't work in silos. But also, as we all seeing the scale of the climate change, the impact, and many of those impacts going beyond the adaptation and what we call the adaptation limit. And that emerges the discussion on the loss and damage. And under the Paris Agreement and the Convention, they have set up the new funding, which is the loss and damage. But this is primarily under the Paris Agreement, as we have the particular article to deal with the loss and damage. Can I move to the next slide, please? Now, if we look into the temperature increase, which is basically the primary reason behind of the temperature increase is the greenhouse gas emission and increasing the concentration at the atmospheric level. As per the latest, the IPCC report, what it already mentioned that the global surface temperature has increased around 1.1 degree above the 1850 to the 90, that's the level. So if we compare that with the Paris Agreement, is basically the target is to keeping it 1.5. We are very close to the 1.5 already. And if we look into the temperature increase, is obviously the average temperature increase is higher in the land and then slightly lower in the ocean because of how the body mass works. But if we look into also the very, very last report that IPCC released and the WMO, what they have mentioned that there was a 66% likelihood of exceeding the 1.5 degree threshold in at least 1 year between this year and the 2027. And it is very likely that temperature will increase 2.1 degree to 3.5 degree by end of the century. So this is the trajectory that we have right now. And therefore it is important that how we are going to reduce the temperature in future by reducing the greenhouse gas emission. Can I just go to the next slide, please? Now, if we just look into how this temperature is going to impact us future, but also impacting us today. And then I'd like to just mention the couple of areas in terms of the water scarcity. And if we just look into the glacier in the Asia, which are the sources of the water for about 220 million people on the downstream. And then this is the one area which the climate change is going to bring a big impact in terms of the security. And the water is linked with the food production. It is linked with the fisheries, the livestock, as well as the drinking water. If we look into the food production, it is also the same area where the impact is going to be greater, particularly the reduction of the crop. If we look into the health sector, it is also going to be impacted, which is also impacting right now, increasing the vector-borne diseases and the waterborne diseases. As well as if we look into the water, the issues, it is also the issue of the flooding. If we look into the temperature, it is also issue of the heat wave. So we have the health impact, as well as the air pollution that Zenata has mentioned. Can I move to the next slide, please? Now, if we move to the other sector in terms of the cities and the settlements, by the 2050, the 64% of the Asian population will be in urban area. And if we look into the coastal cities, especially the cities in South and the Southeast Asia, are expected to see the significant increase in the average annual economic losses between the 2005 and the 2050 due to the flooding. And that includes the flooding in the coastal area as well, and the cities which are also located in the floodplain. If we look into the infrastructure in the cities and outside the cities, they are also very prone to the climate change adverse impact. It is also important to look into the ecosystem and the ecosystem services, and the rising the temperature will increase the ocean acidification and the sea level rise, which will bring the negative effects on the services and the livelihood of the people. So that is the one part of the story in terms of the climate change, how the temperature is increasing and which are the sector that is facing the impact, and the impact is going to intensify in future. Can I move to the next slide, please? Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that under the Paris Agreement, the goal is to keep the temperature below 2 degrees and also aspiring for keeping it 1.5 degrees. Now, if we connect that goal with the current greenhouse gases and how much we need to reduce, it's basically we need to reduce the 45% of our greenhouse gas emission by 2030, and we need to reach to net zero by 2050. Now, if we compare that requirement with the current, the global commitment collectively, is basically that the emission is going to increase 10% compared to the 1990 level. So that is where the largest gap at the global scale. Now, if we look into, next slide, please. If we look into the gaps in the context of the indices that the countries have submitted, and this is the report UNEP has produced in 2021, and to show that in terms of the country's commitment, where we stand, both in terms of the conditional commitment and the unconditional commitment. So if we just look into this graph, if we look into the current policies, which is the 2010, the policy scenarios, as I mentioned, as per IPCC recommendation, that we need to reduce the greenhouse gases 45% below the 2010 level, which they have basically updated that we need to reduce 43% from the 2019 level. So that's the latest. But let's look into the 2010 level. So that is where it will go above the 60 gigatons of the CO2. If we look into the current, the policy scenarios, which will go above the 50 gigatons of the CO2 emission. Now, in the context of the NDCs and both the conditional and the unconditional, if we look into keeping the temperature within the 2-degree raise increase, in terms of the conditional NDC pledges, the gap is the 11 gigaton. And if we look into the unconditional NDC pledges, it is the 13 gigatons. So that is the gap in terms of the 2 degree. If we look into the 1.5 degree, then it is basically 25 gigaton to the 28 gigatons. So the range of the gap is basically huge if we just look into the 1.5 degree. So if we look into the amount of the increase that we need to raise in terms of the ambition to keep the temperature within the 2 degree, we need to increase it at 4 times. If we'd like to increase or keep it within the 1.5 degree, then it needs to be the 7 times. So that is the scale of the ambition that we need to raise in the area of greenhouse gas emission. Can I move to the next slide, please? Now, if we look into the Asia and the Pacific, in terms of the energy use, is basically it emits 73% of the greenhouse gas emission is the energy sector itself. Now, if we just break down the energy sector, is the industry, is the building, and is the road transport. And when we are talking about the efficiency or the consumption, these are the 3 major areas that contributing the climate change and also has the potential to improve them. And another phenomena in the Asia Pacific region is the use of coal in generating the electricity. And the 50% of the electricity is coming from burning the coal. Can I just move to the next slide? Now, in the Asia Pacific region, we have basically looked into how many countries submitted their updated NDCs and what is the status. This is a work that UNEP and UNEP did last year. And we are in the process of updating the 2023, the NDC review. If we look into this update, is basically the second update provided by 7 countries. The first updated NDC submitted by 30, but this number is slightly more now because, as I mentioned, that we are also working on this updated NDC. Now, if we look into in terms of the greenhouse gas, the contribution by those countries who have submitted the updated NDCs is about 82%, which is a good sign. And if we look into the countries who have not submitted their updated NDC, is only the 18%. But this is a good sign from the Asia Pacific region that at least the countries are updating their NDCs, but not necessarily through those updates that increasing their ambition significantly. So we have the 2 parts here. One is the submitting the updated NDC and raising the ambition. Maybe we'll be able to talk a bit later on that. Next slide, please. Now, when we looked into the ambition, but also many countries talked about the carbon neutrality, as I mentioned, as per the IPCC, we also need to go to the net zero by the 2050. If we look into the countries in the Asia Pacific region who submitted and announced their the carbon neutrality, or some countries say the net zero, and we tried to look into whether those announcements supported by the law, the policies, or only the declaration. So when we looked into whether the countries has adopted the law or whether the country has the policy document to support their announcement, we have found less number of the countries has or have adopted their law as well as have the policy document. But many countries, they don't have actually the policy document to support their announcement. Next slide, please. Now, if we just summarize that all the updated NDCs in the context of 1.5 degree pathway, as I mentioned that globally, the emission is going to increase 10% compared to the 2010 level. But when we looked into the Asia Pacific, it is basically going to increase the 16%. So if we compare the global average, the emission growth is higher in the Asia Pacific region. instead of reducing it, it is going to increase compared to the 2010 level. And within Asia Pacific, if we look into the countries, particularly the G20 member countries in the region contribute about 80% of the total emission. So in terms of focus, it is important that we work with the G20, the member state, which is the 7 countries in the region. And the decarbonization of their economy is going to set the pathway or the emission pathway for the Asia Pacific region. So these are the countries that are important, along with a couple of other developing countries in the region. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to quickly mention about, as I mentioned, the G20 member state. There are countries who are taking action in terms of announcing or making the announcement and also putting some of the the measures in place. India is one of the countries who has basically announced the 5 areas where they will be working in terms of reducing their greenhouse gases through the NDCs. And when they submitted their updated NDCs, we have seen that they have slightly moved away from their announcement at COP26. Can I just go to the next slide? Similarly, when Indonesia submitted their updated NDCs, they have not raised the ambition, but what they have done in terms of improvement, they have submitted the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development, the strategies. So that is the improvement that they have done in their updated NDCs. But one thing that we also need to keep in mind when we're talking about Indonesia is the coal is a major use when they generate the electricity in the country. Next slide, please.
Babu, I appreciate if you can wrap up the presentation in about a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if we look into the China, the similar thing that the China has basically raised that they will be peaking their the carbon emission by the 2025. So we're seeing that the countries are taking the steps to raise the ambition, but these are not adequate. Next slide, please. The Japan is a similar thing, but this is one of the countries who has raised their ambition significantly. Next slide. The South Korea is another good example in the region who has also raised that ambition significantly, and they're putting in place the different measures. Next slide. So if we look into what is basically promised by the countries through their NDCs and the national, the announcement of the carbon neutrality, we are not seeing in any scenario that the temperature is going to be below the 2 degrees. So it is going to be anything between 2.1 to the 2.8 degrees centigrade. So that is the range we are talking about. I'm just going to end by connecting it with the next slide, please. With the whole issue of the efficiency issues. And I'd like to just mention cities, which I mentioned earlier, that is the source of the emission, but also the source is where the vulnerability is high. So this is the one of the area that I think merits to talk about the climate change action as well as the resource efficiency, the consumption and the production aspect. And if we just look into the Asia Pacific region, if you just look into the first, the bar, which is the population, and if you look into the emission and their consumption, it is still low, but it is going to go high. So we need to basically keep focusing on the cities where I personally believe that we have the huge potential. Next slide, please. So this is basically repeating what I mentioned in terms of the cities, the growth and the demand, and has the huge potential to work both on the climate change, the resource efficiency aspect. And I think this is my last slide. Next slide. I think this next slide is basically thanking you. Over to you, Ranga. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Babu, for re-emphasizing and highlight the challenges we have with regards to climate change and ambition, and the staggering challenges that we have as a global discussions. So I would like to mention for the participants that our chat line is open, and if you have any clarifications and questions, please use it. Please forward your questions and clarifications into the chat line, so we'll take it. And we decided to take up the questions at the end of both the key presentations, so you have time to put those questions. So thank you again, Babu. And now I would like to go to the second presentation and would like to invite Ms. Hala Razian. Hala is representing the International Resource Panel Secretariat at the UNEP. So Hala has worked with the UNEP, the Secretariat of the International Resource Panel, since 2016. And broadly with the UN system since 2013, including the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. She leads the work on the IRP's flagship report, the Global Resource Outlook, of which the second edition to be released at the UNEA 6 early next year. She's the focal point for the intergovernmental and the regional bodies at the IRP Secretariat, including the UNFCCC. Hala holds a master's degree in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University College London, and a master's degree in environmental management from Macquarie University, Australia. Before the UN, she has also worked in academia, non-governmental organization, and private sector consultancies on sustainable development and environmental sustainability related issues. So Hala is going to present the resource efficiency aspect that we are going to talk among the two sides of the coin. So Hala, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ranga. Good morning, everyone from Paris. Good afternoon, good evening, where you may be. Let me just share my screen with my presentation. And I hope you can see that now in full screen.
Perfectly, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for Switch Asia for organizing this very important webinar as we run up to COP28 later this year. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all. My name is Hala Razian. As Ranga mentioned, I'm here on behalf of the International Resource Panel Secretariat. And just before I jump into the resources angle, maybe for those of you who are not so familiar with who the IRP is, you may know our sister science policy panels, the IPCC, of course, which deals with climate change, the IPBES panel, science policy panel that looks at biodiversity loss, and we at the International Resource Panel, which was founded in 2007, look at the triple planetary crisis through the lens of natural resources. And our main aim is to think about how we can use those resources in a better way without environmental impacts, but with increased economic development and with increased social well-being outcomes for the world. That's the quick introduction about us. And here's a slide that essentially shows why the issue of materials is one that needs global attention. So this slide looks at materials, and maybe when I talk about materials, it's important to know what I'm talking about. In the green here, it's biomass, and that's essentially, you can think of that as crops for food or energy, as well as wood for construction, for example. The gray line here is fossil fuels. I think everyone in this space is really familiar with what that entails. The yellow is metals, and there you have iron, aluminium, copper, and other metals, while that big dark gray line is non-metallic minerals. And here you can think of things like limestone, sand, gravel, the things that are mainly used for construction and infrastructure. We also in our panel look at land and water, but this chart does not include that. And what you see here actually is that our use of materials has been on an alarming increasing trajectory. Actually, our use of materials has tripled since 1970. And findings from my panel, the International Resource Panel, show that if we don't change course, that we could again double this material use by 2060. What we have also understood from looking at extraction, basically what's pulled out of the earth, and use, who consumes those products, is that this process is highly unequal. And you can see here a very crude representation of the footprints of different country income groups. And you really see that materials are not benefiting everyone in the same way, while their impacts are also increasingly concentrated in different areas. And when we talk about impacts, I think what most people don't connect usually is the strong link between how we use these resources, the crops for food, the metals, the limestone and fossil fuels, to the triple planetary crisis. I think the link with fossil fuels and climate change is really strongly understood. But what our scientists have found is that actually the use of the other materials altogether, their extraction and processing, contribute about 50% of global climate change impacts. And this is findings from our 2019 report. We have a forthcoming report in 2024, which considers these impacts to be even greater than what we saw in the 2019 edition of that product. And you can also see the very strong links with biodiversity loss and water stress and production. The way we extract and process these materials contributes to about 1/3 of particulate matter health impacts. That's the PM2.5 that is deadly in large quantities to humans. Well, since this is Switch Asia, I thought I would focus a little bit on how these impacts affect different regions. And this is from our upcoming report. You have the figure on the left, and in that orange, that is the Asia and Pacific region. And in the two charts, two lines all the way to the left, those are the climate impacts. And if you look at the graphs on the right of the screen, you can see Asia and the Pacific, how each of the resources we have talked about contribute to those climate emissions and lead to those impacts. Now you see two different lines here, one with a P under it for the production perspective, and one with a C under it for the consumption perspective. Production is basically allocating the impacts where they physically occur, and consumption is allocating the impacts across the supply chain to where the product is finally consumed. And the difference between the two, you can consider the difference of impacts that's embodied in global trade. And for some impacts, that is quite significant. So what can we expect if we do not change? And here we have a scenario model that the IRP will release early next year that follows the IPCC economic outlooks of projected economic growth, but it also tracks the different emissions that we can expect. And I think this echoes what Babu was highlighting, that so far the ambitions that have been expressed are not enough to bend the curve on our GHG emissions. And that's the solid green line in this graph. And you can see, based on historical trends, we don't talk about business as usual because we feel like everything is very strange and unusual these days. But if we follow historical trends and the commitments we have on the table, we can expect our emissions to grow by 2060 rather than reverse, as we saw was needed by the first speaker. So what can we do about this? we at the IRP, we really think about, okay, we are in a 1.2 degree warming world now, and we want to reach a maximum of a 1.5 degree world. So what in that space, how do we move from 1.2 to 1.5 by being just and redressing some of the inequalities that we see in the way resources are used? And the concept that we identify there is the concept of decoupling. And that's reducing resource use while increasing economic activity and while increasing well-being, but decreasing environmental impacts. And when we talk about decreasing resource use, we are really talking about absolutely, that means, you know, completely delinking resource use from economic growth in high-income countries. But for low and emerging countries, we fully recognize that there needs to be an increase in resource use in the short term to build up the infrastructure and to take people to the basic levels of well-being that we all strive for under the SDGs. But we try to speak, or we try to imagine how that growth in resources can be undertaken in a way that benefits both people and planet. And that's our concept of decoupling in a nutshell. When we think about reduced resource use, this is actually something that other scientific panels have also echoed and spoken about. So the IPCC has stated that a lower demand results in greater flexibility and speed of both end-use and supply-side decarbonization, lowers pollution, and reduces systems cost. And in addition, they have stated that a low energy demand also implies less need for biofuels, which reduces the adverse impacts on food security and ultimately has benefits across different areas. So climate scientists have taken note of the need for reductions in demand. And this is something that also the IEA has taken on board. But sometimes the language of those models hides that they're actually speaking about resource reduction measures. So the IPCC model uses the term energy intensity, and that includes energy efficiency in production processes, but also measures that significantly reduce the need for energy. We see the same discussion playing out in the biodiversity space. And here is a study by IASA, an institute that models different things. And they show that business as usual leads us on a steeply declining trajectory for biodiversity loss. Conservation efforts can have positive impact, but you need to really look at transforming consumption and production systems if you really want to bend that curve on biodiversity loss. So what and how can we think about reducing these demands, reducing the need for resources? The IRP in our future reports coming out early next year at UNEA takes something called a provisioning systems perspective. And that perspective is a concept that emerged that kind of groups together all of the related systems that are needed to deliver well-being. And it shifts the focus of resource use through systems to well-being as the final outcome. Taking this kind of perspective is a potentially impactful way to understand and to identify solutions that can change the way we deliver well-being while also meeting our sustainability goals. And this perspective opens up the realm of possibilities when you look at the different systems. So if you're thinking about electrifying the car fleet, for example, so moving to electric vehicles, you might miss the impacts of the material intensity that transformation requires. So maybe using a provisioning system, you might open up different perspectives like moving to public transport, reducing the need for transport by designing more dense cities or urban areas, or thinking about telework and telehealth options. And that for us is this space that we call better, rethink by design, changing systems so that they don't need as many resources. They are not as resource intensive, but they deliver the same economic and well-being benefits. In our forthcoming work by the IRP, we look at how the different provisioning systems affect the different triple planetary crisis and those impacts. So here again on the far left, you have the climate impacts globally in 2022 by provisioning systems. And you see the green is the built environment, yellow is energy, orange mobility, the blue is food, the dark blue is food. So you can see the contribution of those different systems to climate impacts, and that can demonstrate the urgency and the changes that are required in those systems. So a study undertaken some time ago by our colleagues at Systemic, which could be outdated, big caveat now, but at the time that they did this study, they found that G20 nationally determined contribution focused mainly on energy efficiency measures, but they did not take sufficiently resources into consideration, and therefore they have missed a huge opportunity for emissions reductions by missing out the resource component in their plans. The IRP has undertaken a specific study, resource efficiency and climate change, that looked at different material efficiency strategies like more intensive use, material substitution, so using wood instead of cement, for example, in the housing sector. And they have found that more intensive use, smaller spaces, rethinking how urban spaces are used, actually is the most effective strategy in G7 countries this study covered for reducing GHG emissions. And that's the purple bar that you see here. And the same conclusion can be drawn from this study when it looked at transport and mobility, and it looked at the different strategies, electrification of vehicles versus material efficiency strategies like car sharing, which is the light purple, when they found the most efficient at reducing emissions was ride sharing. So these are kind of very low-hanging, easy to implement solutions that can have an extremely positive impact on GHG mitigation efforts at the national level, across housing, across mobility, if those plans and policies took into account resources. And our forthcoming work in Q1 next year tries to demonstrate that. We undertake a scenario model that looks into a sustainable future that maps these different kind of material efficiency strategies, as well as other resource efficiency, climate and energy, food and land measures that you can see here on the screen, to see how that could impact our resource use and impacts and climate, biodiversity and pollution impacts up to 2060. An important thing about this new work coming up, which we didn't have in our last iteration, is we've added a just transition component. Now, scenario models are not perfect, so this is a quite rough model, but it has tried to ensure that there's no net economic loss for any country in implementing these measures. And it has done so by integrating what they're calling an SDG uplift and a global resource and carbon dividend. And so this is essentially a global transfer of any revenue generated from actions to make sure that those people who are most affected by the changes are supported through the transitions.
Hala, just to remind you about the time, if you can wrap up in about 2 minutes, that will be appreciated. Thank you.
Perfect. So this is what that sustainability transition scenario looks like. The dotted line is the economic growth, which we still see is really strong. And I think interesting for this group in particular is that dark green line. And that is an 80% reduction potential in GHG emissions by 2060 through the implementation of these various strategies. So here, what that actually could look like and what those strategies have been that we have modeled. And it includes moving away from meat, for example, lifetime extension of new buildings, lowering floor space per capita, more intensive use of vehicles. So some of these measures are actually, or most of these measures are implementable now through the right policy measures. But what we also really highlight is that on top of those policies that national governments and actors can take, what we really need is global cooperation and overarching policy pathways that the whole global community can get behind. For one, that means really integrating the resource perspective into global action on the MEAs, climate, biodiversity, and others. And it means thinking about the pathways for resource use at a global level that would allow countries to grow their resource use where needed. And that means other countries need to decrease their resource use to create that space. Of course, changes in finance, trade, sustainable consumption, and the importance of circular economy and circular business strategies are fully highlighted. But if I were to leave you with one message for this forum, it would be a strong call to please integrate your natural resource perspective into your national climate strategies to magnify your mitigation potential. And with that, I will close and share with you the details of how you can learn more about our panel and reach out to us if you are interested to learn more. If you are a country representative who is not on our board, we would love to hear from you if you're interested to join our community and our steering committee. And if you are a scientist who is interested in these works, please know that we have ongoing now a call for new IRP scientists, and we are really looking for new voices to help us amplify our messaging as we move forward. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand over back to you, Ranga. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hala, for that informative presentation and presenting the resource aspect of the crisis. And it seems that both the directions in terms of the climate and the resources are not good. So we are we are compelled to how to think about how to integrate these things. Thank you so much. Dear participants, and I saw there are a couple of comments about asking how you can get the access to the presentation and recording. Of course, you might be able to get access through our website as well as social media channels. So stay tuned so you can get access for all the material. And there are a few questions as well, but I think I'll go directly to the panel because our key presenters will also be in the panel. So apart from the key and the presenters, I would like to introduce the two other panelists we are going to have in our panel today. And one, I would like to invite Putera Zenata, or popularly known as Zen, from the NDC Partnership Support Unit. He's the Regional Program Officer for NDC Partnership Unit, and he supports the implementation of partnerships activities related to all the stages of country engagement and knowledge strategies in Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. And prior to joining the NDC Partnership, Zen also worked in the UN Climate Change, where he supported the regional collaboration centers and organized the 2019 Regional Climate Week in Thailand, Ghana, and Brazil. He also worked in the Ministry of Education in Singapore, championing climate change and education capacity building in the country and the surrounding region. So Zen, welcome to the panel. Last panelist of today's panel is Mr. Sanjay Vashist. He's serving as the expert for the Switch Asia Policy Support Component on the technical advisory on SCP-linked NDC in South Asia. Sanjay has over 20 years of experience in climate change and the UNEP climate change negotiation. And he's also serving as the Executive Director for Climate Action Network South Asia. And prior to that, he worked in TERI as a climate change expert and also worked as a international coordinator for Climate Action Network International in Bonn, Germany, coordinating the activities of ENGO's network. Also acted as a focal point for INGOs in the constituency in the observers under the UNEP. So Sanjay, welcome to the panel as well. So there are a few questions around it, but I would like to start the panel by giving a question to Zen, since you have been supporting the countries in terms of developing, enhancing, and implementing NDCs. So national determined contribution is considered as the building block for Paris Agreement, and it also offers a country-driven framework to align national priorities with the climate change agenda. So upcoming NDC enhancement is slated for 2025. In this context, how can NDCs and the NDC processes can be leveraged as an opportunity to reinforce the nexus between climate change, circular economy, and sustainable consumption and production? So what kind of additional advantage that a country can derive from integrating national priorities into NDC targets? Sen?
Thank you, Ranga. Well, Babu and Hala have given comprehensive insights about the NDC, but allow me to reiterate some aspects. The NDCs really lie at the heart of the Paris Agreement. They are climate action plans that countries submit to the UNEP, and they outline each country's commitments to reduce greenhouse gases and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And as you said, they are updated every 5 years. The next iteration will be in 2025, so that countries can continually increase their ambition. Well, NDCs are important because they provide a framework for national policies as well as international cooperation on climate change and climate action. They also help ensure that all parties to the Paris Agreement are contributing to the global effort. Now, NDCs span a number of sectors, usually energy, agriculture, forestry, land use, industry. Some countries specify subsectors such as transport, buildings, waste, water. And as Zenata said in the beginning, sustainable consumption and production and circular economy are very interconnected to climate change. So in the sectors that I mentioned earlier, already we can see some aspects that are related to SCP and CE. They are included in some NDCs, and some of these interconnections can include countries' commitments to reduce food waste, promote sustainable lifestyles, moving to more sustainable modes of transportations, increasing the use of recycled materials, as well as improving energy efficiency in buildings and industries. So some countries already explicitly mention sustainable consumption, production, and or circular economy in their NDCs. For example, Uganda pledges to apply land management practices that support sustainable and productive use, as well as promote resource efficient circular economy. Another example is in the Philippines. They specify their needs for technology transfer and capacity building to promote circular economy and SCP practices in the country. We have to understand that countries' NDCs vary widely depending on the many factors, including their specific socioeconomic circumstances. So I think the next steps for some countries are to explicitly include SCP and CE considerations and commitments in their updated NDCs, and then to link them to their climate targets, and in time, develop specific strategies and regulations that promote SCP and CE, which will eventually contribute towards achieving their targets. So everything is connected. So support is needed for this, because what good is including SCP and CE goals in their NDCs if they are not implemented in the end? So developing countries need technical and resource support in the stakeholder engagement and planning process, all the way to the project ideation and implementation process. Then taking the opposite perspective, I think it's very important for sustainable consumption and production and circular economic considerations to be included in the NDCs, not only because NDCs are supposed to guide national priorities, but also because they can and are being used to leverage international climate finance. So international funding from climate funds can eventually be used to implement SCP and CE initiatives. I'll pass the floor back to you, Ranga.
Thank you so much, Sen, for that intervention. There are so many questions on the chat lines as well, so I would like to pick a few questions and directed it to the relevant the panel members. So Babu, that's a question targeting you, asking, of course, the country ambitions declared as NDCs are quite good, but it's also important in terms of the implementation. I think Zen also highlighted about the implementation. Would you like to highlight the relationship of the commitments and the implementation, and what we can draw out, especially with the perspective of integrating resource efficiency and resource use into this?
Okay, thank you, Ranga. Of course, without implementation of the NDCs and then their commitment, what they have mentioned, we'll not able to see the reduction of greenhouse gases. So absolutely, the implementation is important. But at the same time, unless the country is also raising the ambition, we'll not able to basically fulfill or achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. So we need to do both. We need to increase the ambition. We also need to implement the commitment. Okay. Now, the way we are looking, as I mentioned, that we are also reviewing the NDCs, not only the ambition, but also what kind of the instrument that they are putting in place. And those instruments basically giving us the sense whether the country will able to basically implement or achieve what they are aiming to deliver through their NDCs. It's like the policies, the strategies, particularly the low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, which is the long-term strategy they need to put. So we are trying to look into the commitment. We are trying to look into the policies, the act, as well as the long-term the strategy, whether the countries are also working. Now, if country is talking about their commitment without any of those instruments, then obviously we'll see that it is going to be hard for the country to deliver that. So we need to look both sides of this, the implementation as well as the commitment. Yes. All right. Now that's my first response. Now, in terms of the whole issue of bringing the climate change and the resource efficiency, I think Hala has articulated it is very well that how these two are basically interconnected. And also the colleague from the NDC partnership also gave the example where some of this is already happening. But if we look into the NDCs and the resource efficiency, yes, there are some examples. But let me just add one point, Ranga, here. If we look into the NDCs, the type of the commitment and the sector that they're talking about, without bringing the resource efficiency, they will not able to do that. So it is the question is how, and how the countries are going to basically deliver. So many of those, the resource efficiency aspect may not be mentioned explicitly, but maybe it's implied that they need to do that. But obviously, it would be good to have that resource efficiency dimension in the NDC explicitly when they are talking about how. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Babu, for the interaction. I can see there are a lot of interesting questions coming up in the chat line, so probably I'll keep on picking those questions and diverting it to the panelists. Sanjay, may I turn to you? Now, I think Babu highlighted the fact that the climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage is not siloed. Those are interconnectedness, and it's in a continuum. And most of the time when we are talking about the resource efficiency and the material consumption, we tend to talk about climate change mitigation. Of course, that's an direct. But at the same time, there are connectedness towards adaptation and resilience building as well, since you are engaging in a technical advisory with the South Asian countries on NDC and SCP. Can you elaborate on this, how this is being looked at, the contribution of material consumption towards climate change adaptation particularly?
Yeah, Sure. No, certainly, Ranga. I think as of now, climate change is seen more from the mitigation perspective, and sustainable consumption and production could also bring some co-benefits on the mitigation. But if you look at the way NDCs are in South Asia, there is a high, possibility, or there is a very good opportunity also to build resilience of communities who are impacted. Babu mentioned about various, how much gap is there in the gigaton and how the temperature goal we are heading towards. I think one major aspect of temperature variable is that natural resources are going to be scarce. Water, food, they're going to be, scarce, and that's where the resilience need to be built in. The productive soil, the loss of production in the soil is going to is shrinking in terms of their production, and that is where higher material efficiency would result into making these available for longer periods. So what is happening now is that on one side, and there is a formula, access to resources means higher resilience for the people also, be it human resources, be it technological resources, be it governance, and be it natural resources. By cutting the consumption of resources would mean making it available for millions who are suffering, who are basically facing the challenges. It adds to their adaptive capacity also. An example is higher efficiency in building sector. Could lead to managing the temperature, but not only that, it could also result into higher resilience of temperature fluctuations here. Babu mentioned about glacier melt, conserving water is important. Glacial melt is resulting into less water available, especially during summer period. Conserving water would mean making it available for drinking and irrigation, so that adds to the adaptation. And then also conserving food habit. Hala mentioned about moving away from red meat to protein, other protein. It can certainly feed millions impacted due to climate impact. So certainly there is a co-benefit of adaptation also. But when we speak about sustainable consumption and production, the first thing comes to co-benefit of mitigation, but then it ultimately also adds to the adaptation.
Thanks, Sanjay. Thank you. Hala, there are a few questions I saw targeting to you in the chat line, and thank you very much for answering some of those. But I would like to ask a question based on one of the points that you have highlighted in the presentation. Now, when it comes to climate potential of material extraction and use, there are some high potential sectors, as you have briefly mentioned in the presentation. But to realizing that potential, of course, there are challenges. On the other hand, there are opportunities too. So weighing all the challenges and opportunities, do you have any particular sectors that you would like to highlight that the countries can consider as low-hanging fruits to untap the climate potential? I think you've mentioned the building sector, but probably there might be a few other sectors too.
Thanks, Ranga. Well, I think the big takeaway message from all of the IRP works is that policies that apply across sectors are the ones that are the most impactful. So you need to really look at the system of provision about how the sectors work together to deliver the end need and target your policy changes there. But indeed, if we're thinking about the Asia-Pacific region, everyone has their favorite hobby horse. But as Babu highlighted, we do expect a significant increase in urban residents and urban regions. Probably the most resource that's being used right now, and the huge increases in resources that we're seeing from the Asia-Pacific are related to a buildup of infrastructure. So for me, as we build up that infrastructure, as we deliver those urban centers that are so needed, we can do that in a way that minimizes GHG emissions while still delivering well-being by designing our cities in a different way. We're already doing this buildup. We might as well do it in a way that delivers the co-benefits for well-being and for climate and for biodiversity. And that just takes, strategies that think about the way resources are used in those systems and how we can minimize that resource use across them.
Thanks, Hala. There's a question, actually, it's been targeted to all the panelists, but I can first ask Zen to answer that, and probably then I'll go a round of responses from the panelists. It's about, do you see a trend in governmental policies of bringing resources and climate policies together? Or are there interesting national examples for such conversations happening? So Zen, I think we have been discussing on this a couple of days ago.
Thanks. Yeah, the trends, maybe what I could share are trends from requests from countries to NDC partnership, which we then circulate to our members for support. If I could share my screen, that's okay. Just do it now. Okay, maybe just a brief introduction. The way we work the NDC partnership, in a nutshell, is that we receive support requests from developing member countries and we circulate them to our development partner members. I'm now showing on the screen some analysis on requests related to circular economy that we've received and circulated. And I think it's interesting to show this to show the directions and priorities of our member developing countries. So we see an increasing trend in the past 3 years in terms of number of requests received. These are requests, again, related to CE. 2019 was especially high because we received 44 circular economy-related requests from Jordan's partnership plan. All these numbers are global. So we see, in terms of sector, from our requests, we see waste, water, and energy making up the top 3. You see the total numbers don't tally because some of the requests are cross-sectoral. In terms of activity types, more requests are most of the requests are related to project developments, followed by developing studies and enacting strategies and plans. By value chain of services, you can see that an overwhelming majority of requests pertain to budgeting and investment, and perhaps more importantly, by support status. We see that about 60% of the requests have not received any responses from development partners. So NDC partnership is not an implementing entity. We rely on our partners to implement support, but also like to reiterate, I think the moral obligations and the moral responsibilities of development of developed countries and development partners to support developing countries in climate action. I would stop there. I have other examples to show if there is time, but I would pass back the floor to you, Ranga.
Okay, right. Thanks, Zen. Babu, are there any kind of trends in terms of country level discussions or conversations in terms of considering the material or resource aspects in the climate policies in the countries?
I am not able to give you the example, the country specific, but let me just mention about in the context of the resource efficiency, but particularly when the discussion happening on the just energy transition and use of the critical minerals, as Hala mentioned about. So the discussion started in the context of how this just energy transition and which will use the critical minerals, that includes the minerals that we are using for promoting the electric vehicles, for an example, which is part of the energy transition, the renewable energy, the discussion. So we are seeing that discussion began so that we don't actually misuse the opportunity to bring the energy or the material efficiency when we are talking about use of the critical minerals when we are moving to the transitioning the energy and the efficiency of the different sectors. So I'm seeing that type of the conversation began, particularly the countries who has signed up the what is called the JETP, Just Energy Transition, the partnership. So that kind of the conversation started in those the countries where the partnership has started. maybe Hala will able to provide more.
Well, it's really interesting, and this is actually work that the IRP is looking into currently. So towards the end of the year, we are releasing a short policy report that looks at the need for transition materials, as we call them, for renewable energy transitions. And we focus on a small subset of those materials that the IEA and others have noted that the need for those materials is going to increase exponentially to meet our transformations into renewable energy systems, to drive us to that goal that we need to get to. So without thinking about the resource impacts and the resource demands associated with those transitions, we are really risking problem shifting, and we are really risking, entering into territory where, to meet that huge growing demand, we push further into territories with critical biodiversity. We're looking at, deep sea mining, and, there's a path that we can take to meet that demand that would be really detrimental. And there's a path that we can take to meet that demand that looks at decreasing that demand to begin with. How do we still meet the energy needs of the global population without needing that exponential growth in materials demand to drive that transition? And that's through circularity approaches, that's through systems design, that's through, rethinking how we deliver well-being through our resource use. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up. And we also have another piece about, this is all well and good, but it is a fact that we are going to need more materials to meet those needs. There's no way that we can deliver those needs without digging up more materials. So when we do need to extract materials, how do we do that in the most sustainable way? And how do we make sure that that delivers just and well-being for local populations and global populations? And how do we make sure that that's possible? So that's another piece that the IRP is releasing early next year. And it focuses in on financing the extractive sector to contribute to the achievement of the SDGs. So I think you have to look at both sides. For those areas where we can reduce the overall resource use, we need to do that. And for those areas where resource use has to grow, we need to think about the best way to do that, to minimize the impacts on climate and biodiversity.
Thanks, Hala. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, panelists. You have already answered some of the questions that came through chat. That's quite important. And of course, there's a kind of a linking question. Probably I'll turn to Sanjay to ask. There are discussions happening around. I think you often highlight this fact that there's an importance to more awareness creation and capacity building among stakeholders to integrate sustainable consumption and production, circular economy into climate change. And you've been also mentioning there are siloed discussions happening. So since it linked to one of the questions came from the chat, why do you think it's important for this awareness creation and capacity building? How can we particularly do that practically?
We already saw two presentations being made separately: climate change and resource. So I think, and these two knowledge need to be brought together, and that would ensure optimum utilization of financial resources. There is a huge discussion going on between developed and developing country about climate finance and all that. So certainly, climate finance or resource finance, how they can be used efficiently, how co-benefits can be harnessed. On one side, climate goals are being set on mitigation and adaptation. On the other side, sustainable consumption and production goals are being set. Can they come closer to achieve the goals? That's where awareness is important. Awareness not only among consumers, but more awareness among policymakers also. Because in the technical assistance that we are working on South Asia, having reviewed nationally determined contribution of South Asian countries, we found many hooks already on sustainable consumption and production. but they may not be because of increased awareness. They are already in the subconscious and they are part of of the thinking of the policymakers. As of now, my personal thinking is that climate change as a commitment is seen to be made to the global community and sustainable consumption production to be made to the domestic community. I think that's not a right thing. I think they need, both are commitments to the global community. We are a global society already. And that's where awareness is important. Awareness among consumers, there are many good examples. LED, the spread of LED, that's because of awareness, and awareness more in terms of economic benefits a family or a person will have. That actually led to the spread of LED compared to condensate. Policymakers, especially policy planners, and there are few sectors like energy or transport which start from climate change. There are other sectors like waste management or tourism, or industries like medium and small industries, especially because they come from the right side. But one brings in the sustainable consumption and production co-benefits, other brings in the climate co-benefits. So we certainly need to harness both. And that's where awareness and capacity building is important. Ranga?
All right, thanks, thanks, Sanjay. Since it's mentioned about the access to finance and climate finance in the implementation of ambition, climate and sustainable consumption and production, Babu, can I ask, like, now, of course, there are a lot of discussions and debates happening on climate finance. And what is your opinion in the role of climate finance to integrate resource use efficiency with climate change at the national level, using NDCs probably? Do you think there's a kind of an additional potential to leverage by considering SCP aspects in climate finance?
Okay, the climate finance discussion, you can spend even hour and a half. But let me just give you the two sides when we are talking about the climate finance and bringing the resource efficiency aspect. Now, one is, as we already talked about, the critical minerals that would require in terms of the just energy transitions. I'm not going to talk about that part, how to bring the climate finance. But if we look into the climate change, as Sanjay mentioned about the resources, particularly if we look into the resources like the water, the land, the forest, where most of the adaptation financing is basically going, either under the umbrella of agriculture or the water resource management, or protecting the coast in terms of the forestry. So I think it would be good to look into how we are, or what lens we are using when we are talking about the resources. Now, if we talk about the water as a resource, obviously, the adaptation financing is happening for that particular sector. In the agriculture sector, it is also happening. Now, obviously, many of those projects is improving the efficiency of the resources. For example, in the agriculture, when the adaptation project is supporting alternate dry or the wet method, or the different types of the irrigation, obviously the resource efficiency aspect is there. So I think it is important what kind of the lens that we are using when we are talking about bringing the climate change adaptation or the climate change mitigation and the resource efficiency or the material efficiency. I think the lens is important, but also looking into the co-benefits, as many colleagues talked about the co-benefit. So it is not only looking into whether it is already there or not, or how to do that. I think the lens is important, how we are basically presenting it.
Thank you very much, Babu. I'm looking at the clock as well. We are reaching towards our time limit. So before I conclude the panel, I would like to give a 1 minute slot to all the panelists to give your 1 minute takeaway from this and what we need to do in the future, because this webinar is not organized as a kind of a standalone event. Of course, it's a part of the process, and we have a lot of potential to work in the future as well. So, as a key takeaway, what you would like to say, how to capitalize on the nexus between climate change, resource use, sustainable consumption, and production. So may I ask Hala to start? Or...
Thanks, Ranga. I think I will just reiterate my call to integrate natural resources into your national climate strategies. Just by starting to take this lens, you will open up many more options that could lead to higher ambition, higher mitigation. So I think that's the first and most important first step that everyone needs to consider.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Putera.
Thanks, Ranga. Let me just share an example, perhaps, of how circular economy has been quite successfully integrated into a country's NDC, and that is Chile. So they're one of the first countries that integrate CE into their NDCs. They focus on construction waste, having learned that reusing some of like 7 million tons of construction waste can save them hundreds of millions of dollars and lead to carbon savings. And they developed a circular economy roadmap that identifies potential emission savings, including short, medium, and long-term goals until 2040. They've established metrics and indicators on circularity to monitor their progress. And the NDC now outlines new policies that hold manufacturers responsible for waste and encourage job creation in the recycling industry. So now we need the partners, international funders, the private sectors to then help implement all these funds. And we have to reiterate that developing countries need the technical and resource support in the stages, in all the stages I mentioned in the example. And because it's enshrined in the Paris Agreement, the responsibility of developed countries to help them. Back to you, Ranga.
Thanks, and thank you. Sanjay?
Well, my takeaway is very simple, but complicated to achieve. We cannot achieve 1.5 degree temperature goal unless sustainable consumption, production, and climate actions are integrated. There is a reference, and there is a Sustainable Development Goal 12, which also on sustainable consumption production. Unless they are integrated, we can keep talking about technological change, renewable, fossil fuel to renewable, and other. But we are into energy transition era now, and energy transition require transformation from existing business as usual consumption practices. We have to transform ourselves so that we do not create another problem if we manage to solve climate change problem in a shorter span.
Thanks, Sanjay. Babu, your turn.
Thank you, Ranga. I think what three colleagues have already mentioned, which is the integration. But to do that, let me just mention what is needed. Is breaking the siloed approach at all levels. And without that, we'll not able to do this.
Thank you very much for those insights. And I would like to thank all the panelists, the key presenters to coming in and giving valuable inputs. Of course, this is a kind of a very broad topic and we can discuss this forever. But I'm sure that we can take away some of the points and contribute in the longer discussion. So thank you very much for the panel. And since we are reaching our time limit, I would now like to invite my colleague, Elodie Maria Sohe, who's the key expert on the EU policies in Switch Asia Policy Support Component, to bring the concluding remarks and finally the vote of thanks of the webinar. Elodie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ranga, and thank you to the panel for these fascinating discussions and for bringing together climate and resources today, really bringing these two bodies of knowledge together. That's what you effectively aim to do, and then you're recommending for us to continue this discussion and to break the silos. So I must say, at the beginning, it was a very challenging discussion because we have such environmental challenges to face with Babu, as you highlighted. We really need to raise our ambition, and Hala as well, you went along those lines. But I also saw some windows of opportunities that we could look into. And Babu, you mentioned cities, that is a critical point where we can make some progress. I also noted, Zen, how you said that circular economy is there in the NDCs. It's and it's appearing through the requests that you are receiving. I noted, Sanjay, how communities will increasingly benefit from this resource efficiencies, and climate adaptation will benefit from SCP. And I think the key message from Hala on looking towards global policy for SCP, and Sanjay, you reiterated that SCP is not about the citizens, it's about really the global policies and bringing these commitments to a global level, and that is where the solution may lie. So I think we'll continue these discussions at the COP and bringing resources and climate together more and more for us to together tackle these challenges. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you
very
Chidori.
much.
Thank you very much, the panelists, participants, everyone, for your patience and kind contributions. And of course, there are a lot of questions came from the participants, and thank you very much, the panelists, for answering some of the questions. And as I mentioned, this is not a one-off event, and we are planning to continue this discussion and the interventions too. And please do engage with our website and our social media. We will keep on providing material and the outcomes of the discussion too. And you can find all the presentations and the recordings also in our website, Switch Asia website. So please engage with us. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you in another webinar like this in the future. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.